One example of a love spell was buttock spread, which is a charming recipe, literally charming, for attracting somebody that you think would make a good partner. You make some bread dough and you literally knead it with your buttocks. You can say, potential sort of charm or a spell at the same time, something you knead away on the table. And the idea is that you're transferring some of your own essence and your spiritual essence into this bread so that...
Welcome to the History Extra podcast. Fascinating historical conversations from the makers of BBC History Magazine. If you've lost something valuable or want to improve your marriage, have you considered consulting a cunning person? As Tabitha Stanmore explores in her new book, in medieval and Tudor England, these practitioners of everyday magic were not outsiders on the margins of society, but were well embedded in communities and consulted often. I spoke to Tabitha to find out more about the spells, charms and magical potions that these cunning folk offered. Thank you so much for joining me, Tabitha. Let's get right into it. Who were cunning folk and why might you visit them?
So, cunning folk is a very, very broad term, and it basically refers to people who had some kind of magical skill. They could have maybe one spell that they knew really well, or they could have a whole range of kind of magical knowledge that they would use to affect change in the world, normally something quite mundane or quite practical, like finding lost or stolen spoons, all the way up to love magic to healing. And there were people who would just offer this service to people within their local community.
And just to clarify for listeners, before we go any further, what kind of time period are we looking at here?
So, cunning folk existed way back into the Anglo-Saxon period and probably earlier. They weren't always called cunning folk, but they go back a really, really long way. And you could say they still survive today. But the period that I look at is roughly the 14th to the 17th centuries. So the late medieval, kind of 14th, early 15th century, up into the early modern period, the 16th and 17th.
I bet there are a couple of people listening who are thinking, is this just another name for witches? But you argue in the book that this is actually something very different. Can you explain that difference for us?
Yes, I can. And yes, thank you for raising that. It's something I've had to clarify many, many times because you say magic and you say early modern and immediately people think witch trials. But no, I argue that these are very different people. And I think there's a lot of confusion nowadays because the term witch has got a very broad definition now. It refers to somebody who can be empowered or possibly, quite outspoken. It could be somebody who has a magical skill or is very good at healing or herb lore, or it could be somebody who harms people and uses demons and that kind of thing. Think hocus pocus. In the late medieval, early modern period, that's not really the case, which has a bit more of a specific definition, and that's somebody who does harm using magic and often uses demons to do that harm as well. And cunning folk are separate to that. Cunning folk are the people who were doing the healing, the useful spells, kind of performing benevolent magic most of the time, and certainly practical magic. Whereas witches tend to be they tend to be seen as very spiteful people who are just trying to harm others. So I see them as very, very different. When I was doing this research, I was really surprised that there was this difference because I, like everybody else, had just assumed that witches were the only kind of magical practitioner and that they were kind of this big catch-all term. But yeah, actually there are separate categories going on here, and cunning folk is not witches.
So you've alluded there to all the different services that a cunning person could offer. And I really want to delve into some of those because you've got some incredible stories in your book. But before we do, what kind of people are we talking about here? Is it possible to make any generalizations about what sort of social status cunning men and women had? And I mean, I've given it away there, but cunning men and women, was this people of both genders as well?
Yeah, it was. And it's actually really hard to say what a typical cunning person was like because there isn't really a typical person. They could come from all social strata. They could be all genders, and they could be any age as well. So at the kind of the lower end of the spectrum, we have, your average labourer or farmer could be a cunning person on the side, all the way up to a university-trained physician or even a kind of advisor to a king or a priest could also practice cunning magic. So it's really, really broad. And as you say, women and men both practice magic. And from my research, I think it's about a 50-50 split between men and women, because we have this stereotype of women being more magical than men in history. But in the case of cunning folk, anyway, that's not the case.
That's really interesting what you said there about cunning folk being labourers or physicians. So these weren't kind of old crones on the outside or the edges of societies living in a hut in the woods necessarily. They were people embedded in communities.
Yeah, very much so. And that's partly because they performed useful functions. People needed them. So, of course, they're going to be part of their communities because they are actually sort of constantly being called on. And yeah, it was often that cunning magic was used as a side business for a lot of people. So, as you say, they would have a normal day job. They would be often married, they'd have children, and they would be very central to their community as tailors or farmers or whatever else. But then they would also have this magical skill, which they would also have a reputation for.
Can we say anything about the people that turned to cunning folk as well? Were they also drawn from a really wide cross-section of society?
Yeah, really wide. Yeah, possibly even wider than cunning folk themselves, because you don't find that many magical practitioners who are monarchs, but you definitely find monarchs employing cunning folk. And again, all the way down to somebody who could be very poor and ostracised in their village might still go to a cunning person if they're sick or their animals are sick and then they need help.
So before we turn to some specific examples, I think some of the stories in your book, if you come to them out of context, they're very, shall we say, eye-opening. Some of the stuff that happens, it's bizarre, it's strange. To us today, it seems quite crazy. But before we get into that, I think it's kind of important to contextualise it, because you say in the book, to the pre-modern mind, magic was a rational part of the supernatural universe in which people lived. I wonder if you can explain that to us.
Yeah, absolutely. So the way I normally go about this is by trying to sort of set a scene by saying that you need to imagine that you're living in a world where God unquestionably exists. And I'm mostly referring to England or the British Isles here. But this is a time where Christianity is the dominant religion, and it's pretty much just accepted that, you know, there is a supernatural, largely benevolent, mostly, creator of the universe. And there's also his counterpart, the devil, who sort of walks abroad and can do harm and meddle in people's lives. And in between those two very powerful supernatural characters, there are also these other kind of creatures like fairies and angels and demons and that kind of thing that are also active in the world. And the entire understanding of the universe is based around this. You've got angels, which are thought to move the planets around the sky. You've got the understanding that if God created the universe, then he must have written messages inside it of how things work and given us powers to be able to influence the world around us. So within that context, it makes perfect sense that some people will go, hang on a second, we have all these supernatural powers. Maybe we can use them to our own ends. And prayer is partly a form of that. It's seen as a very kind of orthodox and non-blasphemous form, whereas magic is often seen as quite blasphemous by at least high churchmen. But that's the world that people are living in. It makes sense to them. And honestly, if we didn't have the scientific education that we have now, I wouldn't be surprised if we would also kind of come up with our own theology about how the world works.
So magic wasn't always at odds with the religious mindset of the day. It fit within it.
It was a necessary and inevitable part of it, I would say.
Fantastic. So let's get into it and talk about some great examples from your book. Something that you look at is cunning folk offering up love spells. What can you tell us about them? And also, what do you think that love spells can tell us about marriage and courtship at the time?
Yes. So, there is a chapter in the book called How to Find Love, and it is the stickiest, gooeyest chapter in the entire book. And I really enjoyed writing it. I really enjoyed researching it because love magic, it was one of those ones that you can actually really relate to as a modern person as well, because a lot of the things that were being asked for were things that we still ask for. So finding a good relationship, being able to salvage an unhappy relationship, being able to end a relationship in a way that sort of frees you up. The methods that people used are a bit different to what we would now use. No couples therapy, but there are lots of spells to, for example, improve your sex life. There are also spells to, when I say end relationships, I mean murder your spouse, which would not recommend. But yeah, it's a really broad spectrum of spells that are available for what could sometimes be impossible situations. Because bear in mind that, again, we're looking at the 14th through 17th centuries. Divorce just isn't an option for most people. And leaving your partner did happen, but it caused a lot of social stigma, both for the person who had been left and also the person who left. So this wasn't really something that people could turn to most of the time. So they would turn to magic as a solution instead. They might also turn to their local priest for interventions and sort of guidance, maybe. But often it was more like, okay, we hate each other. How are we going to make this better? Let's try a spell and see if that works.
I guess it tells us, doesn't it, about as you say, the impossible situations many people found themselves in, and how marriage for some was something kind of beyond their control, really.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've got to bear in mind that there could be love in a marriage, there could be affection in a marriage, but it was also very much an economic union. It was a way of surviving in many ways, because bear in mind that a lot of people are living at subsistence level. So they are mostly relying on farming, and everything is kind of handmade and hand prepared. And so you kind of need at least two people in a relationship to be able to keep a small farm going, say. So coupling up and raising children together and that kind of thing became a very, very important part of being a functioning member of society. So that's a lot of pressure that a lot of people felt to get married in the first place, and then a lot of pressure to keep that marriage working. So yeah, there are spells for finding a suitable partner, which we can go into if you like.
Yeah, that would be great. Can you give us some examples?
Yes, absolutely. So one example of a love spell was buttock spread, which is a charming recipe, literally charming, for attracting somebody that you think would make a good partner. It's basically where you take some bread dough and you literally knead it with your buttocks. And you say, potential sort of charm or a spell at the same time, something like, this is my intended, may he love me as much as I love him, or maybe he be filled with desire or something like that while you knead away on the table. And the idea is that you're transferring some of your own essence and your spiritual essence into this bread, so that when you then go and feed it to your intended, they will be inflamed with desire and not be able to stop thinking about you until you eventually get married.
Wow, that's incredible. It strikes me as very imaginative, I would say, which makes me think, were there stock spells or potions or methods that people would use for certain things, or did each kind of cunning person have a different approach?
So there was definitely individual variation all the time, partly because a lot of these spells would move around by word of mouth. So it's only inevitable that obviously people are going to sort of pass on their own versions. But there are some stock approaches that keep coming up again and again. One is sympathy magic. So the idea that you can form a sympathetic link between two people, and you can influence them by doing that. That's also what a lot of cursing sort of relied on, this idea that you can sort of cause harm by somebody, sometimes by harming yourself, but then it will sort of rebound onto the other person. And that comes across in love magic, as I've already mentioned, but also healing magic as well. So a cunning person would often go and visit a sick patient, and they would do something to form a sympathetic link between the patient and the cunning person. So that could be taking the urine of the sick patient and kind of sort of using that to kind of diagnose the illness. Then also using that urine to try to repel the spell or that could have been kind of cursing this person, or even repel the illness from the person. So a very common method from the 17th century is to lift a curse from somebody who's been harmed by a harmful witch, is to take the urine of a sick person, put it into a bottle, and fill that bottle with pins and the hair of the sick person as well, and then bury that in under the threshold of the person who's sick, or potentially even just put it in a fire and let it boil for a long time. And the idea is that that will cause a sympathetic link between the person who cast the spell and the person who's suffering. And that will mean that the witch who casts the spell is in so much pain, they'll literally feel that they've got pins and needles and that they're actually kind of boiling alive almost, that they will decide to lift the spell. And then the person, the suffering patient will recover. So sympathetic link turns up a lot. And sometimes some cunning folk would even try to take the illness that the person is suffering from into themselves. And so then the cunning person would start exhibiting the symptoms of their patient, and therefore providing relief to the person who is suffering.
Yeah, it strikes me as, from what you're saying, quite a powerful role. Because if people are coming to you and they're saying, I want so-and-so to fall in love with me, or I want revenge on X, Y, and Z because they did this, you're entrusted with a lot of knowledge within a community. And knowledge is in many ways power. But did this ever get cunning folk into trouble?
Yes, yeah, because as you say, it's a lot of power. It's a shocking amount of power in some cases, and there's a lot of responsibility. And yeah, there's a case from the 14th century where involving two members of the nobility, Lady Constance Despencer and her uncle, I believe, Edmund Langley. And they had both had very expensive items stolen from them. So Lady Constance had lost a beautiful cloak that was sort of trimmed with fur, and Edmund had all of his silver stolen, his silver cutlery stolen. So they're both very keen to get this stuff back. And they have all sorts of different resources at their disposal, being nobility, but they decide to go to a local cunning man to ask for his help. And the cunning man very helpfully says, yes, I can tell you exactly who it was who stole all of these things. And he names 3 men who live in London and are actually part of Edmund's household. So Edmund and Constance, as I say, being nobility, having their own private bailiffs, I suppose, or kind of law enforcement people, actually have these 3 men arrested. And these 3 men get horribly beaten up, and they get thrown into prison. And the next stage of that is that they were going to be put on trial and then banished from the city, when they would just never be able to return to London again. And this is obviously very harsh, and it's based solely on the word of this one cunning man. Fortunately, the local magistrates, kind of the City of London, intervenes and says, hang on a second, we haven't found the stolen goods, and we also don't have any evidence that they actually were the ones who stole this stuff. So the sentence ends up being revoked. And the cunning man himself ends up being flogged and then exiled from the City of London. I don't think he's allowed to return for 10 years or something like that afterwards. So it's a really interesting case because firstly it shows exactly how much authority a cunning person could have, as well as the fact there's really no rule of law at this point. But also that there could be really serious consequences to a cunning person if they get it wrong. Yeah. And so they're taking a risk themselves a lot of the time as well.
Well, what was the legal status almost of magic, this kind of practical magic at the time? Was it legal to do this kind of thing?
In the 14th century, it wasn't illegal to do it. The church condemned it, and so there are kind of church courts, ecclesiastical courts at the time, who are responsible for policing this kind of activity, not because it was magic per se, but because they saw it as potentially a form of blasphemy or even a form of idolatry, depending on what sort of higher powers you're calling on to make magic work. So the church wasn't particularly happy about it, but they did generally turn a blind eye if it wasn't doing any harm. So, for example, we don't have very many cases of fertility magic from this period because the church, really didn't have a problem with people using fertility magic on a day-to-day basis. That said, if it did cause harm, that's where the church and also the secular courts start getting more interested. So the reason we have John Birking, who's the cunning person I referred to before, the reason we have his record is because of this miscarriage of justice that happens at his hands, and it's the public harm issue that's being put on trial. It's not so much the magic itself. When you get into the 16th century, that's when things start to change and we start seeing more policing of magic. So in 1542, we have the first Witchcraft Act introduced, and that is under Henry VIII. And he basically, it's mostly about prosecuting witches, so that kind of harmful Malefician style magic. But also cunning folk do get a mention. And so I think it's provoking unlawful love, looking for buried treasure using magic, or finding lost and stolen goods. Those are the three things that this act actually completely outlaws and says you will be put to death if you practice this kind of magic. It was never actually used, this law, because it was too harsh and people didn't want to report people for doing cunning magic. So it's not until you get into Elizabeth I's reign where some cunning folk or some cunning magic activities become prosecuted, because she introduced a slightly less harsh law, which basically says that cunning magic, again, the same category, so finding lost and stolen goods, lost treasure, and unlawful love, that can be punished with a year of imprisonment instead. Interestingly, healing doesn't get mentioned at any point in any of these laws. So even though we kind of have the stereotype of people being prosecuted as witches because of their healing powers, that wasn't actually anything that was ever formally legislated against.
While we're looking at the connections between magic and the law, you have a whole chapter in the book that you look at how you might use magic to affect the outcome of a trial. That sounds pretty underhand. Can you give us some examples?
Yes, so it is underhand. Again, it does expose quite a lot of the corruption of this period. But it also kind of makes sense, I suppose. I mean, I think most of us would like to have a positive outcome if we're ever put on trial. So one of the most startling examples, I think, from the book is actually the example I open the chapter with, where the Bishop of Salisbury and the Earl of Salisbury are locked in a dispute about some land. The bishop insists that he's had control over it for the last 200 years, and it's definitely his. And the earl is like, well, no, it's mine, and I currently occupy it, and there's not much you could do about that. So the two sides decide that they're going to try to resolve this dispute by doing a trial by combat. So it's quite surprising because this is a 14th century case. Trial by combat had mostly died out at that point. But it was still thought that if you had two champions from one for either side engaged in a trial by combat, then God would basically intervene and choose the victor and therefore the one who was in the right. The Bishop of Salisbury decided that maybe this wasn't enough. So he actually had spells sewn into the armour of his champion, which was kind of protective charms. It was also ones to sort of give his champion more strength and better prowess so that he would win. And again, we know about this case because the two champions were called off the field just before they started to do battle because they'd realised, so the organisers had realised that they hadn't checked the armour to make sure there weren't any of these kinds of spells in it. And you actually see in a lot of guidelines of trial by combat, make sure that nobody's using spells. Because,
wow.
Yeah, it was a well-known thing. Also quite hypocritical of the Bishop of Salisbury to do this. Obviously, this is the kind of thing he should be condemning, but needs must when you have a weak case.
Fascinating stuff. You also look at conjurers, so people who were essentially stage magicians. What kind of magic shows might we see in the medieval or the early modern era?
Oh, so many. It's amazing. So obviously magic now is used as a form of entertainment, whether that's because we make lots of films about it or because you can go and see stage magicians. And some of the things that you can see a stage magician do now are actually from the early modern period. So I don't know if any of your listeners ever went to a kids' magic show, either their own kids or when they were children. But if anybody remembers the taking a long piece of string and then saying some words over it, then all of a sudden it gets chopped up into 4 or 5 small pieces of string. You don't know how that happens. And then they get linked back together again magically. That is actually explained in great detail about how that works and how to do it in a book from the 1590s called The Discovery of Witchcraft. There's also things like the hidden pea trick. So you have lots of cups and you have a pea hidden underneath one of them and you try to kind of work out where the pea has gone. That again dates from at least the 15th century, probably older as well. But also then you've got the other end of the spectrum, because those are kind of like street entertainments at the time. If you look at the courts, like the royal courts of Europe, then you'll see very, very impressive forms of magic being performed. So, for example, something that a lot of magicians attempted, and I have no idea how they did this, so please don't ask me. A lot of magicians claimed that they could cast these incredible illusions. So there are actual spell books that survive from the 16th and 17th centuries that explain how to summon images of huge castles, for example, just appearing in a clearing in a woodland, or being able to produce, I don't know, angels to descend from the sky and that kind of thing. And they're very clear that these are illusions that they're conjuring. They're not actual real objects or people, but they still claim that they work. They've actually got we've got marginalia that says, "Ah, yes, cast this illusion, king was very impressed." Again, don't know how it works.
Well, that's so intriguing, because as a historian, how do you kind of deal with information like that? For example, this idea that information is presented, we cast a spell, it worked, we did this thing, it worked, but you've got no information about how exactly it works. That must be so tantalizing.
It is, it really, really is. And if I could get in a time machine and watch and see what happens, I would love to. I think as a historian, I try not to pass too much judgment on these kinds of things, because, frankly, you know, my cases come from 400 to 700 years ago, and I wasn't there. I don't know how this stuff worked. I do know that they reported that it did. And for some things, you can explain it. So, for example, identifying thieves, there's a lovely spell involving a lot of dried cheese, where you basically you say you've had I don't know, your horse stolen, and you think that there's 5 people who could have done it. So you get all those 5 people, you invite your local cunning person to interrogate these people by using dry cheese. So the cunning person takes a small piece of cheese, blesses it, or sort of carves a little charm on it, and then feeds it one by one to the suspects. And if the person chokes on the cheese, then likelihood is that they are the guilty party. And so people would think that that was being done by magic, and it could well be being done by magic. Again, not here to judge. However, if you are guilty and you know you're guilty, and you have somebody who you know has a very strong reputation for finding thieves right in front of you, and then you're asked to swallow some dry cheese, you might well choke.
Interesting. Psychosomatic effects, yeah. So I wonder now if we could turn, Tabitha, to dark magic. Where did that sit in the cunning person's toolkit?
Yes, so this is the point where cunning folk and witches do start walking a very blurry line, because there were some cunning people who did offer harmful spells. Often that was as a part of a revenge narrative. So somebody, for example, was having a horrible dispute with their neighbour, and they wanted to get revenge. You could go to a cunning person, and in some cases, not all cunning folk would agree to do this. Obviously, everybody has their own moral compasses, and some would see this as well past their, or beyond their remit. But a cunning person could, for example, explain to you how to perform a spell to cause that person to die or suffer real harm or hardship. And this was before the Witchcraft Acts of the mid-16th century. So both the church courts and the secular courts would be interested in these kinds of cases, because somebody is trying to cause actual physical harm or even commit murder. And so again, it's not normally the actual magical practice which is being prosecuted, it is the outcome that's being prosecuted, and this intent to harm or actual harm in some cases. And so you can see how you might also expect these to be just sort of lumped in as witches. The difference seems to be, in most people's minds at least in the period, that a cunning person is a kind of amoral agent in this situation. It is the person who's commissioning the murderous magic that is actually the one who should be prosecuted and is doing the harm. Whereas when we're looking at witchcraft cases, often that's a person performing the magic themselves, and they're normally trying to cause harm just out of spite. A cunning person generally does it because they're being paid, not because they are spiteful. So I guess it's a difference between almost a hitman and a first-degree murderer, if that makes sense.
It does, absolutely.
Yeah.
There are so many incredible stories that you've uncovered for the book. I wonder if there are any that we haven't already mentioned that just really stuck with you or you think would really resonate with listeners.
Oh, there's so many. Yeah. I think one that always sticks with me is is a case of healing from the 15th century, where a woman has a young child. We don't know the child's name. The mother's name was Elizabeth, and her child was probably roughly 2 years old, something like that. And she was sick. This child was wasting away. She had been a very healthy baby. She'd been sort of feeding and very happy. But then she goes very, very quiet. She stops making any kind of noise, and she stops eating as well. And so the mother just panics, basically, and she doesn't know what to do. She's tried everything, and so she goes and seeks out her local cunning woman, who's also a woman called Elizabeth, confusingly. And she asks this cunning woman to come and have a look at her child. And so the cunning woman arrives, and she looks, and then she goes away without saying anything at all. And obviously the mother is panicking once again. You know, this woman who has a very good reputation for healing has said nothing and has left. So Elizabeth goes and seeks her out again and says, you know, well, can you help me? And the cunning woman says, I don't know. She's very, very close to death. I don't know whether I can help her. It will put my life in danger to do it as well. But eventually the cunning woman agrees. And so she says to the mother, take your child to bed. Around midnight, the child will start to recover. And then the cunning woman stays up all night, taking the illness into herself. And she says afterwards that it did almost kill her to take that amount of sickness. But by 1 o'clock in the morning, the child has stirred and is beginning to feed again. And then she recovers, grows up, becomes a very healthy sort of, I think this case is when she's about 8 years old or something like that. That's when we first have a record of it. And I think it's such a human case. We can imagine exactly how terrifying it must be to have a young child that you don't know whether is going to survive. And also the kind of desperation the mother must have felt and the desire to do anything possible to save this kid. But also, you know, the cunning woman, she does genuinely believe in what she's doing, and she's very proud of being able to save this child when it eventually happens. But she has got genuine fear as well. She doesn't know whether she's going to be able to survive this ordeal herself. And so there's so much compassion that can go into cunning magic, as well as, you know, it can be exciting, it can be juicy, but it's so human, a lot of these cases.
And that story really makes me think about the motivations of these people, because of course some people would look at this and they would say, these are simple con artists, they're putting on an act and they're charging people money for it, and it's as simple as that. What would you say to that if we're looking at unpicking what was really going on here?
So I would say there's definitely cases of that. Yes, of course, not every person who claimed to be able to do magic was sincere in their beliefs, and of course we have a lot of instances, because of the way that records survive, we don't tend to have instances of really positive outcomes. We tend to have instances of kind of negative ones. So yeah, of course there were fraudsters, and I completely accept that. But I think it's important to recognise that cunning folks survived on their reputations. They would often live in the same village their entire lives, and so people would know them for a really long time. And if they weren't good at what they did, then they wouldn't have been employed, and they wouldn't have been able to say very proudly in court when they finally end up there, yes, I've been practicing for 25 years and I can present to you several examples of very happy clients. So however it worked, it clearly did for some people. And there were a lot of people who were very proud of their skills and used them wisely.
And finally, Tabitha, do you think we can see any legacy of all of this today?
Yeah, I really think we can. The term cunning person has died out a bit. But if you go on TikTok or Instagram, then you will find so many examples of manifesting, basically. So people using the power of their mind to make something happen. And you can even buy manifesting journals in Waterstones. So it's, you know, this everyday magic, and the idea that you can make your life better, you can get richer, you can be healthier, you can be happier, you can find the person that your soulmate. by using the power of your mind and certain simple rituals, that hasn't gone anywhere. So yeah, I think we definitely have modern day cunning folk existing now, even if they don't call themselves that.